Yeah.
Oh, really? If I were home, I wouldn't see her at all?
Mm-mm.
I could come in my jammies. I could come in my jammies. Well, I really don't have a good view of you.
We'll move to that chair.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I guess that's. Okay, Rick. Hello? Is that it? Oh, yeah, right. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming, the attendees, and thank you who are watching in their dwellings on the TV. And a special shout out to our founder who's watching on TV. Hello, Charlie. Our speaker today is Genevieve Chenault. Genevieve and I was trying to think, we go back almost 20 years. Started in the infamous
Seems like a day.
Genevieve said it just seems like a day. So we've been friends with Genevieve, and then we had the delightful experience of meeting Hank when they came here to Covenant Woods, and they've been good buddies since they've been here with the Cooks. Genevieve was born in a small college town in northern Louisiana. And she grew up in another college town near Savannah, Georgia. Both of her parents were college professors, and her mother taught English. Genevieve was doomed from birth to become a teacher, preferably an English teacher. She graduated from Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. She received a master's degree from the Teachers College that is now part of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Subsequently, she taught English in Georgia, South Carolina, and additional graduate studying in North Carolina. Completing her move up the East Coast, she married a Virginian. There she got the religion. She moved there in 1958. Genevieve and Hank lived first in Danville, then in Roanoke, and finally made the trek to Richmond. Hank developing career as a newspaper journalist, participated in the moves. But Genevieve taught English in each location, finally at VCU and at St. Catherine's School on Grove Avenue. Of course, Hank, like Genevieve, was also an English major. The couple have 2 children. One double majored in organic chemistry and biology, the other in computer science. Go figure. But I'm going to add her third set of family. And she found more love the older she got. She has 2 or 3 exceptionally talented, brilliant great-grandchildren that she and Hank adore. I'm going to turn the program over to Genevieve. I just want to add, as we listen to her with her presentation, she's the kind of person that when I'm in a group with her, when she speaks up and says something, I'm like, I wish I had known to say that. Everything she says makes the best sense using the best English. And I think that's what among the many things I enjoy about her, that's one of the top ones. Here is Genevieve Chenault.
Thank you, Midge. I think I better leave now before I ruin that introduction. But anyway, thank you for that. And thank you, Charlie, for, first of all, pestering me to do a presentation, and then saying, do it about a Richmond author, and then finally letting me pick Ellen Glasgow as my subject. Is my voice okay? All right, good. I'm going to talk about Ellen Glasgow, obviously, who was born shortly after the end of the Civil War and lived through World War II. She was born in Richmond, and although she did not want to live in Richmond, she did live in Richmond almost all of her life. She became a best-selling and much talked about novelist and her biography reads like a soap opera. I'm also going to talk especially about one of her late novels named The Sheltered Life, and it was published in 1932. This is probably the most famous portrait of Ellen Glasgow, showing her as a mature and successful author. This is an earlier picture, and she's wearing a drop waist lace dress and a headband, and she's dressed in the high fashion of her day. She was very petite. She wore a size 3 shoe, and she slept in gloves at night to keep her hands soft. I have tried to find out how tall she was, and I have gotten reports that she was 3 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 303 pounds. So I think there's something wrong there. I have tried to find pictures of her in groups to judge her height, and she looks normal but small. And late in life, she grew quite plump and did not like her fatness. The later picture is as she was a mature author. It's interesting because it's dedicated when she was in her early 50s. It's inscribed to James Branch Cabell, a good friend and another Richmond author about whom I will talk later. These are Ellen Glasgow's parents. Her father was Francis Thomas Glasgow, descended from the Camerons of Rockbridge County, Virginia, and originally from Glasgow, Scotland, as you may have gathered. They came to Virginia, the ancestors, in 1766, and her father was a very scholarly man. He was a graduate of Washington and Lee. He was a staunch Calvinist. He was a member of Second Presbyterian Church in Richmond, and according to Ellen, he gave his wife and children everything they needed except love. He lived to be 86 years old, and Ellen wrote, he never, quote, committed a pleasure. Deal with it. In Richmond, he was superintendent and manager of the Tredegar Iron Works, a position that had been secured for him by his uncle or his brother-in-law. I've read different accounts. Obviously, you remember that Tredegar was the biggest producer of ironworks for the Confederacy, supplied about half of the South's military ammunition, artillery during the war, did the shell for the ironclad ship, which was called the Virginia in the South, I understand. Mr. Glasgow had some slave laborers and some slaves that he used in managerial positions during the war years. After the war, he still worked at Tredegar Iron Works, and that firm lasted up until the mid-1900s, but he kept the firm going, doing railroad ties and other pig iron. His employees remembered him as being always just, but said he never had an intimate friend, so I think he was a very difficult man. Ellen wrote that she inherited nothing from him except the color of her eyes and a share of a trust fund which he had accumulated with infinite self-sacrifice, and I think he made them aware that he was being self-sacrificial. On the other hand, she wrote, everything in me, mental or physical, I owe to my mother. Her mother was she doesn't look that way here, but she was a very caring, sharing individual. Obviously, her parents' marriage was a union of opposites that never should have happened, according to Ellen. However, they had 11 children. Ellen's mother, Anne Goldson, was descended from Virginia aristocracy, from the Randolphs and the Yateses, and she was a Tidewater belle. The couple married in 1853, and their first child was stillborn. 2 more children died in infancy. A third died before maturity. A fourth committed suicide as an adult. Of the 6 surviving children, almost all would experience the same sort of debilitating depression that Mrs. Glasgow experienced. I would have been depressed after 11 children, too. Ellen was the 8th of the 10 children who survived. At birth, she was so small and frail that for 3 weeks she was carried on a pillow. No one believed that she could survive. But she grew up under the loving tutelage of her Mammy Lizzie Jones. Mammy Lizzie was an extraordinary character, African American, of course, endowed with unusual intelligence, a good sense of humor, a good temper, but she could neither read nor write. She loved looking after children. She looked after several of the Glasgow children, and later on, she left the Glasgows to move to another family. One interesting thing about her was that before this time, she, in her youth, had cooked supper for General Lee the night before the surrender at Appomattox. This subject, you will soon learn, has taken me down more little side roads and tributaries because I turn the corner and I think, oh, that's interesting. I got to go investigate that. Okay, Mammy Lizzie would take Ellen to play on Capitol Square or in front of St. Paul's Church because they lived nearby. But increasingly, Ellen had to stay indoors because she had diphtheria and scarlet fever and a morbid shyness and almost constant headaches. How are you going to survive with that? She also had many friends. She was too nervous as a child to attend school for long, but she educated herself by reading from her father's extensive library, fiction and nonfiction. She borrowed books from the state library because there was no public Richmond library at that time. At an early age, she taught herself to read by picking out letters in a book by Sir Walter Scott named Old Mortality. And I have tried to read Sir Walter Scott, and I can read, but I couldn't read him. So that was an amazing accomplishment. When Ellen was 7, Mammy Lizzie left to tend children in another family. And Ellen wrote at that time, age 7, I knew at 7, as well as I know now at 60, that the happiest time of my life was already over, that childhood was ending, that I was entering the grown-up years when you have trouble and more trouble for as long as you live. I knew suddenly that I was alone, that I had always been alone. And that's a terrible way to approach life, but that's Ellen. She first lived in a house which no longer exists in Richmond near the intersection of First and Carey Streets. But when she was 14 years old in 1887, Mr. Glasgow sold that house on Carey Street and purchased an older, larger, square gray house that had been built in 1841 by David Branch. And Branch is another important name in Richmond history. And it had been occupied for more than 40 years by Isaac Davenport, another important name in Richmond history, by Isaac Davenport and his family. Now, that she keeps referring to the house as the old gray house, and this is the way it looks now. It's tan. But here at 1 West Main Street, Ellen lived for the remainder of her life, except for a brief sojourn in New York City. She wrote short stories and all but one of her novels in that house. After her death, the house belonged in succession to the Virginia Historical Society, the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, the Junior League of Richmond. In 1982, a Richmond law firm assumed occupancy and furnished the house in 19th century style. For 4 years, it remained with that law firm, and then in 1986, Jack Pearsall and his wife Tricia and their 2 sons moved into the house. For 34 years, this house, 11,000 square feet, Greek Revival, 6 bedrooms, 5.5 bathrooms on a quarter-acre lot, and the Pearsalls lived there. The son said when they moved in, they had 5 bathrooms, but only 2 worked. Okay, right now, since September, this house has been on sale for $3.5 million. So move on. The mirror in the front parlor, which is shown there on your slide, is from Jane Madison's Montpelier residence. The gas chandelier has never been converted to electricity, and the upstairs bedrooms have 13-foot ceilings. Ellen had a very wealthy brother named Arthur, who actually owned the house after the parents died. And at one point, Arthur paid for extensive renovations of the house, enlarging the bathrooms. And this is one of the bathrooms that's still there. The house is unique in Richmond because it has been consistently preserved and occupied as a private residence ever since it was built. Today it's known as the Glasgow House, and it's a National Historic Landmark. In addition to this house, Mr. Glasgow owned Jerdone Castle. That's a 485-acre farm and house. And the house was begun in 1742. It's in Bumpus, Louisa County, 50 miles from Richmond approximately. The property was purchased when Ellen was 5 years old and was sold when she was 13. This is the landscape around the house, and in those 8 years when the family would spend summers at Jerdone Castle, Ellen would roam the fields during the summer months, and she began to love nature, and especially she began to love animals. When she was 7 years old and was here, she said she realized, almost as if it were a divine calling, that she was destined to become a writer, and she never gave up on it. Right now, Jerdone Castle is a Virginia Historic Landmark. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and much of the original 1,000-acre estate is part of Lake Anna. The current estate is only 125 acres. After spending the summers at Jerdone Castle, Ellen would go back to Richmond, and she wrote, "I crept back into the cold darkness, where there were set tasks I could not do, where nightmares came in my sleep, and sinister apprehensions stayed by me in daylight. I was not ever a normal child." At least she knew it. She describes herself, as I said, as having that morbid shyness and headaches, except for the months that she was at Jerdone Castle. Okay, here's Ellen as a young lady. In 1889, at age 16, she made her debut in Charleston, and her older sister, Carrie, lived there. Carrie was married. Reports vary. Ellen writes that she was an extremely popular young lady. Her chaperone, on the other hand, wrote that Ellen was unattractive, a hopeless, difficult lump, dumb as a dolphin. They're definitely contrasting. Later, she attended dances at UVA and I think did a little better, but never very successfully. When Ellen was 20 years old, that's 1893, her mother died of typhoid fever after a long period of suffering from an undiagnosed malady that Ellen attributed to the exhaustion of bearing children and the hardships of war and Reconstruction. But it was most probably the result of that same nervous temperament that Ellen had inherited and some of the other children had inherited also. By the time that Ellen was 22, she was troubled by a loss of hearing. There was no cure for what was the hardening of the eustachian tube and middle ear. She said science had failed her body as religion had failed her soul, so she took up golf. She played golf sometimes daily and deliberately built what she called a wall of deceptive gaiety around herself and cultivated the ironic mood and the smiling pose. Those are her phrases. Evidently, as a young lady, she was admired for wit and charm. Various photographs show her in the costumes of the day, and I like the last one, the one on the right with the hat on, but she was a very fashionable young lady. When she was 26 years old, Ellen met her first love, the man to whom she refers in her autobiography as Gerald B. And about him, there has been much controversy. He's never been identified. Some researchers even think that he's a work of fiction. However, we learned from Ellen that he was a married man, he had 2 sons, that he was a New York financier, and that he died in 1905 of an inoperable ailment, which she did not define. During 7 years, the couple met only briefly during her visits to New York and during at least one trip abroad to Switzerland. Lots of speculation. A doctor, a psychiatrist, other less distinguished occupations have been assigned to Gerald B., but I don't think anybody will ever know who he was. 2 years after Gerald supposedly died, Ellen became engaged to the Reverend Frank Ilse Paradise. He was a handsome minister who lived outside of Virginia, but he had performed the wedding of Ellen's older sister, Carrie. After 3 years, Ellen broke the engagement and never told anybody why. She was plagued by sadness, and she became increasingly morose and depressed. And there were 3 deaths that particularly depressed her. The suicide of her brother-in-law, George McCormick, as another suicide. And he was definitely her mentor. And so she was very close to George McCormick. Her brother Frank committed suicide in 1909. Her sister Carrie died from cancer in 1911. And her younger sister Rebe married and moved to Lexington, Virginia. After Carrie's death, Ellen moved to New York City, and she lived there intermittently for 4 years. During her absence, her oldest sister, Emily, decided to clean up the house, and she burned all the original manuscripts of Ellen's writings, which had been stored on a closet shelf. Ellen returned permanently to Richmond in 1916 after Emily had died. She didn't want to speak to Emily. And her father had died, although she had hoped never to return to Richmond. She commented that she was drawn back inevitably to the place where she had suffered most. The only surviving male member of the family, Arthur, Ellen's brother, contributed handsomely to her financial support. He and his wife, who was a Branch, Miss Branch from Richmond, they had moved to London, and he had become quite wealthy, and in 1908 he set up a trust fund from which she and her siblings benefited. She also received royalties from her books and was comfortably provided for, even though her income dropped during the Depression. She spent money lavishly on clothes. You can tell that from some of these pictures. She traveled widely in Europe. She consulted expensive doctors. She gave lavish dinner parties. Once she wrote Arthur that she had had to borrow $4,000 for her summer vacation, and he sent her a Christmas present of $6,000. However, she and Arthur didn't particularly like each other, and they saw each other as infrequently as possible. Of course, Ellen never married, but there continued to be men in her life. The most interesting involvement was with Henry Anderson. Now, she identified him in her writings as Harold S., but we do know that the man in the slide here was Henry Anderson. She was 43, it was 1917, and she became engaged to this man. He was a dashing, doesn't look dashing, but he was a dashing, eligible bachelor, a wealthy lawyer, and a social climber who had originally come from Southside, Virginia, but had learned social behavior in England, and he affected an English accent. He lived very near 1 West Main Street at 913 West Franklin Street. That's right in the VCU area. He was, in 1920, endorsed as a vice presidential nominee for president, national vice president by the Virginia Republicans. He was, in 1921, the Republican candidate for governor of Virginia. He was defeated, however, by Democrat Lee Trinkle. He served during the 1920s under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. He served under Hoover in D.C. He was one of the founders of the Hunton and Williams law firm. So that's the way it's known now. The original name included Anderson. He was one of the founders of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and he was president from 1947 to 1954 when he died. The couple, Harold and Ellen, Henry and Ellen, seemed to make no wedding plans. World War I came along, and Anderson went to Romania as a colonel in the Red Cross. There he became romantically involved with Queen Marie of Romania, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And here she is. She was noted for her beauty and for her promiscuity. Marie had been married to Ferdinand I of Romania since she was 16 years old, and she had borne 6 children. This is Queen Marie. She was featured on the cover of Richmond Style Weekly magazine in 2017. And there was quite a story about her. The headline, World War Romance between Ellen Glasgow and Anderson, was noted there. While he was in Romania, he quit writing Ellen, and after his return to Richmond, their relationship changed abruptly. But Ellen kept his letters. He wrote in all, you want to guess how many? 750 letters. And they are preserved in the University of Virginia Library along with her other papers. In despair at the state of their romance, Ellen attempted suicide by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. She later wrote that their love had lasted 17 months out of 20-plus years. And she said, I have had as much love and more romance than most women, and I have not had to stroke some man the right way with my bread or the wrong way to win my freedom. To stroke some man the right way to win my bread or the wrong way to win my freedom. There's no evidence that Glasgow or Anderson ever had a sexual relationship, and she repeatedly emphasized that she did not want to be married, and she did not want children. After Ellen got over this period of depression, she began, when she was 50 years old, the best part of her life, between ages 50 and 60. She said, I lived during that decade perhaps my fullest and richest years. She had enough money to enjoy trips in spring and autumn to New York and gathered there with her circle of friends. She wrote her best books beginning in the 1920s, all of them except one written in the house here in Richmond. During this period, she relied increasingly on the assistance and encouragement of her secretary, Anne Virginia Bennett. Miss Bennett was an invaluable aide who was with Ellen for 40 years. Back in 1911, when Carrie was slowly dying, this trained nurse had been hired to tend her, Anne Virginia remained with the family through the deaths of Emily Glasgow and Mr. Glasgow, and had become an invaluable friend, aide, nurse, and companion for Ellen. The two women also shared a love of animals, especially of dogs. As a child, Ellen was furious when her father gave away her pet dog, and as an adult, she bestowed her sustained love on dogs rather than on suitors or anyone that she seemed unable to sustain a happy relationship with. Anne Virginia loved dogs and disliked men as much as Ellen did. However, Henry Anderson shared Ellen's love of dogs, and for Christmas in 1921, he gave her a white pedigreed Sealyham Terrier puppy, which she named Jeremy. For Ellen, it was love at first sight. This is not Jeremy on your screen, but this is a Sealyham Terrier. Thereafter, both Ellen and Henry seemed willing to live with their cooled relationship because they could share the love of the dog. Jeremy seems to have been an unusual dog. He ushered guests into the parlor of the 1 West Main Street house, and he showed overnight guests up to their rooms upstairs. About a year later, he met a French poodle named Billy. Jeremy began to sit in the window to watch for Billy and then run downstairs to invite Billy to come into the house. Eventually, Ellen managed to buy Billy from his owners, and the two dogs became inseparable. They were taken for daily rides in the car, and vacation plans were altered to include them. While she was in England in 1927, Ellen wrote postcards to Mr. Jeremy Glasgow and Mr. Billy Bennett. As she motored through England in Arthur's car, driven by Arthur's chauffeur, she was interested primarily in dogs, ruined cathedrals, almshouses, and fellow authors. She delightedly discovered that there was a branch of the SPCA in almost every village. A year later, Jeremy became ill. Ellen stayed by his side for 2 gallbladder operations. The second one was performed by Dr. Stuart McGuire, who was not a veterinarian. He was a well-known surgeon. But Ellen had to recover from Jeremy's surgery, and so she went to Maine to regain her health and prevent what her doctor predicted would be a nervous breakdown. She was recalled from Maine when Jeremy took a turn for the worse, and she was at his side when he died on September the 5th, 1929. Anne Virginia Bennett proceeded to call Virginius Dabney, who was editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and asked him to write Jeremy's obituary. Possibly he remembered ways in which Ellen Glasgow had helped him, and so Dabney agreed to the unusual request and went into the hushed house to gather facts. He wrote later, and this is in his autobiography, "Many obituaries were assigned to me during my 11 years as a reporter, but this was by far the most difficult of them all. I wrestled with the obituary for a couple of hours. The obituary appeared on September the 8th with a snapshot of Jeremy and occupied about a column of space. It began, Jeremy, the pedigreed Sealyham Terrier belonging to Miss Ellen Glasgow of Richmond, is dead. The little dog, which always greeted visitors to the picturesque old Georgian mansion at 1 West Main Street, was such a favorite with them. He died Tuesday night after a long illness. He was 8 years old. Blyle's funeral home embalmed Jeremy and placed the body in a small casket which was buried in the backyard of Ellen's home and marked with a marble stone. Sympathy notes poured in internationally. And within the next year, Ellen expressed her plans to have Jeremy with her eventually in Hollywood Cemetery. The Richmond SPCA had been chartered in 1892, and Ellen became a member a year later. But the organization remained dormant until Ellen became president of the chapter in 1924. Thereafter, she was a vital leader for 20 years. Often the annual meeting was held in her home and was considered one of the galas of the year. She also campaigned against inhumane treatment of mules in construction work. Her extremely fine collection of porcelain dogs is now owned by the Valentine Museum. She was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Richmond Public Library. She marched with suffragettes in 1909 and later helped organize the Virginia League for Women Suffrage. However, her interest in this movement and her period of rebellion passed, and she grew more tolerant of aristocratic values after 1925 and grew increasingly skeptical of industrial forces and liberal political ideas. She was elected to Phi Beta Kappa at the College of William and Mary in 1920 and later was awarded doctoral degrees by the University of North Carolina, University of Richmond, Duke, and William and Mary. So everybody knew about her. During her life, she reigned as the literary aristocrat of Richmond, and social events in her home were legendary. She always ate her breakfasts alone in her bedroom, but dinners were formal occasions served in the dining room of her home, served by 2 waitresses and prepared by the colored chef in the kitchen. Ellen Glasgow was remembered as a lady. She was usually dressed in dark colors. Her nephew, Carrington Tutwiler, the son of her sister, remembered her as a grande dame and said, "I never caught her in an informal moment." Conversation at dinners was dominated by Ellen, partly because of her increasing deafness, and she had a hearing device, which was shaped sort of like a Coca-Cola bottle, I gather, and she would put it on the table, and you had to speak directly into that, and she had the other end in her ear, so she could talk to only one person at a time. Here is a dinner party on your screen, but it's not in Ellen's home. It's in the home of James Branch Cabell, who is depicted there also. She is seated to James Branch Cabell's right. She's facing him, and the cut line on this, the photo was taken by Dementi, which was a Richmond photography firm. Says, if you look carefully, she is covering the lower part of her body with a big fan because she didn't want people to know how fat she was. Beginning in 1917, she had enjoyed summers on the coast of Maine, and she went to just south of Bar Harbor every summer. Anne Virginia went with her, and she took a chauffeur and a cook with her. She knew she was in failing health, and she signed her will on April the 15th, 1944, but she added codicils during the next 18 months. She remembered and provided for her current servants and certainly for Anne Virginia Bennett, who continued to live in the home after Ellen's death and was responsible for the dogs. After Anne Virginia died, the remainder of the estate was held by trustees for the benefit of Richmond's SPCA in memory of Jeremy. On November the 1st, Ellen had a mild heart attack while she was getting a permanent in the beauty parlor of the Jefferson Hotel. Anne Virginia was with her, and Anne Virginia sent the chauffeur home for a bottle of scotch and gave Ellen half a glass straight. Ellen revived, and Anne Virginia asked the male beautician to please hurry because Ellen, at age 72, hated the idea of dying in public. So she got home okay, but 3 weeks later, on November 20th, she entertained the SPCA meeting in her home. And Thanksgiving morning, November 22nd, 2 days later, Nathaniel went to take her breakfast. Nathaniel, an employee, went to take her breakfast and found her body in her bed. For 2 days, she lay in state in her bedroom under a white canopy. The funeral service was by invitation only, and it was conducted at 1 West Main Street. It was it was featured her favorite flower, yellow roses, and there was no music. 75 friends and relatives were invited and attended, and Henry Anderson came too, but he had not been invited. James Branch Cabell was in Florida for the winter and did not return. And Brother Arthur was afraid of catching a cold because he said many of his friends caught colds at funerals, and so he did not come. The procession carrying Ellen's casket made its way to Hollywood Cemetery, and Virginia Stabney was one of the pallbearers. There was a purple heart of pansies that was sent anonymously on behalf of the homeless cats and dogs of Richmond. With Ellen's body in the casket were the remains of Jeremy, and supposedly, some people think Billy was there too. Ellen wrote an autobiography during the last 20 years of her life. It was named The Woman Within. After she completed a chapter, she sealed it in an envelope, placed the work in a briefcase in a locked bank vault, and said it should be opened after her death by her literary executors and published by Harcourt Brace, and that's what happened. In 1954, the book was published, and we found out that her life was considered by her to be a long tragedy. Obviously, the publishing of this book caused a lively stir in Richmond, and James Branch Cabell was furious about what it said about him, but the book was very widely read in the Richmond area. I'm going to go to her, first of all, a picture of the Glasgow Monument at Hollywood Cemetery, and then a copy of her book, The Woman Within. These are other books related to her. Her first novel was The Descendant, and that's the first book depicted. It was published anonymously in 1897, and most people thought it was had been written by a man. There is no author's name on the book. The middle book on the slide is The Deliverance, which was published in 1904, and it's about the Virginia tobacco fields. In This Our Life, which is depicted there on the right, was her last completed novel. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was not nearly as good as The Sheltered Life that I'm going to talk about, but it was made into a blockbuster movie that obviously included Bette Davis and Olivia de Havilland as battling sisters, and it also had Charles Coburn, Billy Burke, and Hattie McDaniel in the cast. Ellen Glasgow meant to write a social history of Virginia from pre-Civil War days to the present. And this page lists the way she organized them. If you can't see it, Midge has copies for those of you who are here. And those of you who are viewing at home, I hope you can see it. And if not, you can call me and I'll get you a copy. She wrote the third book on the list first because she said it was the easiest to deal with. It was about Jerdone Castle. And the first book chronologically is The Battleground, which was published in 1902, and it's the only one that deals with the Civil War. Viewers in Richmond can see and hear the effects of the battle from the landscapes of Richmond. Glasgow's early novels feature strong males as main characters, but as you might guess, after her experience with men, she got away from that idea. Her heroes become weak, self-indulgent, and definitely faithless. Her later works expand the theme of the Southern lady emerging from the plantation society into the 20th century. So she's grouped these by the historical study of Virginia, by novels of the rural areas of Virginia, and by novels based in Richmond. I want to talk specifically about one of the last books, The Sheltered Life. It was published in 1932, and it was publicized by articles on the front pages of book sections of both the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune. Many critics praised the book, but Clifton Fadiman wrote, "There is nothing here which retains freshness or vitality for us today." Ellen was still talking about the class structure of Virginia rather than what Fadiman thought was a real problem of the South, which was racism or illiteracy or poverty. The Sheltered Life is definitely related to Glasgow's memories of life in Richmond, contrasting the society she knew as a girl with the philosophy she adopted as an adult. Glasgow believed that the South, despite the effects of the Civil War, had maintained the idea of the Southern belle who combined beauty and charm and was encouraged not to think too much. The Sheltered Life is dedicated to that brother, Arthur, and it tells the story of the Archbalds and the Birdsongs who live on Washington Street, and Washington Street is obviously Main Street. They live in Queenborough, which is obviously Richmond, in a deteriorating neighborhood. Repeatedly, they can smell the chemical plant, which is DuPont, and supposedly that smell in the novel symbolizes that the old modern world is attacking from outside and the destruction of the old South cults of beauty and romance is going on. The novel is divided into 3 sections: the age of make-believe, the deep past, and the illusion. The sheltered life of make-believe disintegrates in violence after the heroine, Eva Birdsong, can no longer deny reality. Now, the novel is told from 2 points of view. In 1910, there's a section by the little girl named Jenny Blair, and in 1917, her grandfather talks about it. Jenny Blair Archbald was 9.5 years old when the novel starts, and she's being paid to read Little Women, a penny a page. She lives with her widowed mother and her grandfather and 2 old maid aunts, and she's being raised to become a debutante. She's self-centered and naive, and she is being sheltered to avoid facing unpleasantness in society and is being prepared to lead a sheltered life. The age of make-believe introduces us, that's the first part of the book, introduces us to Jenny Blair and her relatives, and we also meet the Birdsongs, Eva and George, who live at the other end of the block. Eva is recognized everywhere as being the Queenborough beauty. She has been reared as a Southern belle. She moves through life as with a perfect smile pasted on her face. She never complains. She personifies the legend of make-believe because everyone knows that her husband is a hopeless philanderer who has a Negro mistress a few blocks away from Washington Street. And that first section takes us to a meeting of Jenny Blair and that mulatto mistress. The second section is General Archbald's reminiscences, and it has been called the best thing she ever wrote. He remembers life as something that he never could do the way he wanted to do, and so he's sort of morose and sad as she is. I chose this book to look at several reasons. One is because I like the title, and The Sheltered Life is the kind of life that Ellen Glasgow lived herself as an aristocrat. It's the kind of life that she was brought up to live and did not live. Another reason is that throughout the world, she said, throughout the world, ideas were changing. The familiar order was going. Beliefs and certainties were going. The shelter for men's lives of religion, convention, social prejudice was at a crumbling point, just as it was with the little human figures in the story. The novel comes to a violent end, and the question remains at the end, will this sheltered life continue or not? And obviously that was the theme of much of what she wrote about the Society of Richmond. Everything in this novel takes place in Richmond, and actually everything described about the house in which Jenny Blair lives is reminiscent of the house at 1 West Main Street where Ellen Glasgow lived. So we've come full circle. And that's it, and that's more than you ever wanted to know about Ellen Glasgow. But thanks for listening. You, we had a tour of the house, and Hank and I have been in the house to concerts, right, when the Pearsalls lived there. So it's an interesting figure, and I think I've established this, that rich brother Arthur, who lived in England, is the multi-benefactor of Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, VCU, Second Presbyterian, various other places in Richmond. So,
Did you say where he got his wealth?
he moved to England, and he established a chemical gas plant there.
Oh, okay.
And made loads of money.
Did she get paid well for her novels?
She got paid well enough. For instance, she was offered a $30,000 contract to make a movie of The Sheltered Life and turned it down. And $30,000, not chicken feed then, yeah.
But then she must have agreed to the movie of In This Our Life.
Yeah, and that was closer to her death, and I don't know why. I didn't read any comments about why she did that. When she was in the hospital, for instance, in New York City, right before her death, she took her own cut work pillowcases and had a manicurist and a hairdresser weekly, and they would visit her in the hospital. So she could pay her way, or Arthur paid her way for her.
Because in the novel, The Sheltered Life, the Birdsongs didn't have money. George just sort of scraped along. And
George
Eva
had
didn't.
inherited but lost
and then
money.
Lost that.
Yeah.
Right. And so she lost access, this beautiful woman, to more items. She was very admired, but she didn't have a lot of money to do some of the things that Ellen Glasgow did.
Oh, no. Not at all.
Yeah.
Do you think she was a feminist?
Ellen, yes. Mm-hmm.
The book, The Vein of Iron.
Okay, well, yeah, I had more notes than I thought I had time for. The Vein of Iron was named that for several reasons. One is she said her father had a temperament that was a vein of iron. The other was the ironworks of Tredegar, that. And yesterday, I started reading one of the novels, Life in Gabriella. Just happened to pick that up. And in the first chapter of that, she has used both the phrase vein of iron and the phrase sheltered life to talk about stratification, social stratification in the area. So, you know, she kept playing that same note over and over again. And she wanted to be, I think, during her younger decades, more of a liberal, more of a suffragette, more of a mover shaker than she was able to in the end when she settled into being the aristocratic literary leader. Yeah. She characterized Richmonders as being very non-intellectual, interested in gossip and clothes, and not being capable of having deep thoughts, really.
Is this one the Miller of Old Church? Is that the old church down the road?
Not that I know of, no. No, I don't know anything further about that one. So, the four best books, supposedly, let's see if I've got that. Of course, I like The Sheltered Life at all, certainly. But Virginia is, not from 1913, is a female character in Tidewater, and that depicts useless aristocrats. Barren Ground, in 1925, there is a struggling woman named Dorinda, and she struggles with the land and finally creates a dairy farm, and she's been compared with Scarlett O'Hara. This book was published before Gone with the Wind was published. Ellen Glasgow read Gone with the Wind and admired the book, but she had created Dorinda before Margaret Mitchell created Scarlett. And there was another one I wanted to talk. The Romantic Comedians I have not read, but people seem to think that was a good one too. There we get a cuckolded old man who married a glamorous young thing and lived to regret it. Marriage was never happy in her novels. So it always created problems.
But she had nothing to base a good marriage on.
No, she didn't. No. No happy families.
Is this Virginia a person or a state?
It's the name of the character, the leading woman. It takes place in the state of Virginia, but it's the name of the heroine. Yeah. Yeah. So, y'all have listened long enough. That's it. It's 3 o'clock. Well, Hank will tell you I got addicted. He would say, "What are you doing now?" "Oh, I'm looking up more stuff about Ellen Glasgow."